Hi, I'm Dr. Sarah Black, and this is the first session in a series on advanced research design for master's students who are working in the field of education. This series is going to look at different aspects of research design to do empirical work, mostly focused on qualitative empirical work. And what those terms mean will become more apparent as we move through the series. But in this first session, we're going to explore the following ideas. We're going to think about what research is, and we're going to think about the different aspects of a research design that needs to come together in order to make that research credible and trustworthy, and also, I might say, interesting. We'll look at a little bit of terminology that helps us to think about the sorts of ideas that matter when we're thinking about research design. Particularly, we'll look at a few ideas from the philosophy of social science, although we won't go into that into too much detail. But there are a few ideas that you need to be aware of when you're thinking about how the different aspects of your research design hang together. And this first session is going to be built up out of 3 parts. In the first part, we're going to look at a little exercise that I have given students in the past that illustrate challenges in research design and the importance of coherence between the different aspects of the research design model that we'll use throughout the course. We'll then look at what is called epistemological unconsciousness, i.e. the kinds of ideas about how knowledge is made and how it is trustworthy or not, and what we should do to produce trustworthy knowledge, and where these ideas might come from. In particular, how they affect students' ideas around methodology as it relates to social sciences and qualitative work. And finally, we're going to look at the interactive design model that we will use throughout the course, which is from the work of Joseph Maxwell. And we will start to unpick what each of the components mean and how we're going to move forward through the rest of the course using that lattice as the framework to guide our conversation. I really do want to be quite specific, though, as to what this series of lectures does not do. We are not going to look in depth into specific methods, and that includes how to conduct an interview, or how to do an observation in a classroom at a school, or a university, or a community college. It's not going to go into how to design a survey, or how to do critical discourse analysis on a text or a conversation. Because there are so many research traditions, there are so many different potential foci, and there are so many different expertise areas, that each one of those would need a course in and of themselves. What this course is about is design, not methods. So methodology, not methods. And it's about how what you do in the field to produce data, the categories you use to think about turning information into data, the questions you ask, the literature you review, how you check that you have a valid understanding of what's going on, how these things all cohere together to answer a question appropriately. Okay, we're going to start with the first component I mentioned. And this is a fun little exercise that I have given students that they really enjoy, although it often produces some confusion by design. And it's called a color swatch activity. I call it the color swatch activity. And what it involves is giving students a random set of color swatches that they are told they can organize in any way they see fit. They just group them. There's no rules, there's no guidance, there's no purpose. Just take these color swatches, which I'll show you in a moment, and put them into groups in however you think you want to. And I chose color for a very particular reason, because color is very tricky to categorize. There are perceptual differences in how we see colors, even between people who are not colorblind or have some kind of measurable inability to see parts of the visible light spectrum. We still see color subtly differently from person to person. And on top of having a perceptive subtle difference between different observers, There are also conceptual differences in how we name colors. So, for example, in different languages, different colors, the visible color spectrum that we see as a rainbow is cut up differently, where people draw the lines between the start of one color and the start of the next is different in different languages. So Russian has different words for different tones of blue. In Istrosa, we use the word lukhlaza to talk about blue and green, but you would say blue like the sky or blue like the grass, or green like the sky, green like the grass, because they're the same thing. In linguistics, that's called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and it starts to get at the relative relationship between the signifier and the signified, between the word we use to denote a particular idea or concept and the actual concept that it's attached to. So this is why I chose color, because it starts to surface some of the problems that creep in to a badly designed piece of research. Here's what the students were given. The original batch of color swatches they had looked like this. As you can see, the squares and the rectangles are all different sizes as well. In fact, I don't think any are square, they're all rectangular, at least how it seems on this screen to me. The actual selection of hues and tones is as random as I could make it. And this is what the students are given as the raw material to process and group and categorize. I'm going to show you how some of them went about doing this. So obviously what I was hoping for is that people would take assumptions about categories. They would make assumptions about common categories that you learn in primary school. This is red, this is yellow, this is green, this is blue. And they would try to cluster the swatches into those categories, which, as you can see, starts to get quite sticky quite quickly because there are some colors that do not fit neatly. So we've got blues here, shades of white, shades of beige. You know, one sort of finds oneself hovering between two potential schemas about what color categorization means. Are you going with the scientific one based on some kind of measurement of the way that your retina responds to certain wavelengths of light? Or are you going with the Dulux Plascon paint swatches you see down at the local hardware store? You can start to see already in this one that where one of those schemas starts and one of those schemas stops is not entirely clear, but we've got a mash of all of them. The next student, the same thing. Different shades of purple. These are different yellows. I mean, one of those yellows I would not call yellow, I would call it green. But that's the point of the exercise, is to illustrate how these things are not as straightforward as they might seem. Now, this student did something very different. They didn't go with color categories. They went with 3 categories that seemed to imply a tonality or a warmth. And then the 4th category was not of a type. So here we've got a nice illustration where you have some kind of a categorization framework. You have a concept which is warm, neutral, cold, but then the concept rainbow doesn't really sit on the same level as warm, neutral, cold. So that's a nice example where you can end up with slippages if you have a categorization system that is not systematic or is not sort of sitting on the same type of ground between the different types of categories. Here we have another type of categorization system that again uses some kind of tonality or saturation level, pastels, dark and muted tones, bright tones. Very difficult to replicate. If I gave someone else those swatches and those categories and said, right, bunch them, you would not come out with the same result. And I like this example from a particular student who was an art teacher, because what it shows is how your training and how you see the world and the kinds of schemas you use to interpret the world shape what you see and what you perceive and what you observe. So this person saw the palettes of particular famous paintings, clustered them like this. And this particular person made up a little rhyme to convey the confusion they experienced during this particular exercise. I really love this little rhyme. Hues of blue and yellows and green, what's it all about? What does it mean? I do not have a clue, do you? Well, you won't have a clue if your research design's bad. And that's precisely where we're going with the next idea. So rather than bunching by color, which is clearly not a rigorous or replicable or clearly well-defined set of groups, one person tried to arrange the swatches by the height of the swatch, by the number of pixels that each rectangular swatch registers on height. Now, ostensibly that could be objective, in that if I measure it at 320 pixels, someone else will measure 320 pixels, and the cardinality of ordering numbers on the number line means that we'll come out with the same ordering. But is it useful? Just because a method gives us nice, neat results, it doesn't mean it's helped us to see anything unusual or different, or to explain something in information or data we've collected. And what was also interesting about this was that eventually this student admitted that when they were struggling to really order this set of swatches systematically using the height of the swatch, that they started changing the size of the swatches, which was a lovely conversation to have, because it shows what happens when the categories you've chosen to try and make sense of the information you've got, if they're not appropriate or they're not operationalizable, you can't actually do them. In this case, you probably could, but if you couldn't, you kind of start wanting to shoehorn a square peg into a round hole. You start wanting to cook the data to fit the categories you've decided on, or fiddle the data, or leave out the swatches that are difficult or inconvenience. But that is not intellectually honest or ethical. So that was a nice example where we ended up with an objective, but not particularly, at least superficially useful, categorization schema. And we came across the problem of the temptation of making the data fit the premises, which is not research. So that was a nice offering from a student. And sometimes the categories someone uses are totally subjective, and you wouldn't expect someone to be able to replicate them. So we don't have to find an agreement on what does red mean, or, are we going to use the height of the swatches? I'm going to use the categorization frame of colors I might paint my house, colors I won't paint my house. And that is a subjective framework based on my own idea about what looks nice and what doesn't, what's my own sense of aesthetic. But it's a valid categorization schema if that's what I'm trying to do. Now here's an odd one. Again, objective, useful. You could order the colors based on their representation as hexadecimal codes in RGB values for computer RGB codes. And the framework of hexadecimal color notation is a nice example because it's 2 red bits and then 2 green bits and then 2 blue bits stored in a sort of 6-bit code. Sorry, 6-byte code for color storage. You end up with this privileging of the first 2 of red. So the red content is red first and then green and then finally the blue. And it has some interesting visual consequences, as you can see. It's rigorous and replicable, but it's not really what you'd expect. The point is, the same information can be ordered in a multitude of ways depending on the schemas and categorization strategies you use to create groups and the logic behind those. All right, we're going to talk a little bit now where that logic comes from. I mean, you pluck it out of the ether. Why did you choose color? Why did you choose house paint? Why did you choose warm tones? Why did you choose hex codes? We're going to look at that in a moment. But also think about applying those groups systematically at scale. So if someone sent you 100 bags of those swatches, well, where would you start? How would you even begin? I mean, what if your dog ran through the room halfway through your work and scattered them everywhere? Could you put them all back the same way? So is your method replicable and reliable? Do you get the same thing when you look at the data through that lens? So you might have some questions on your mind, having seen all those different ways of categorizing color swatches. And I love running this exercise with my students because I get something different every time. It's really lovely to see how people think and how their thought patterns frame what they see. You might say, well, why am I organizing color swatches? What am I doing? Why am I doing this? You might say, well, where did they come from? Are there other color swatches? Have I got them all? Are some more going to come along and throw the grouping I thought was good? Why are these swatches? Why not some other swatches? Why these ones? Why are these ones special? Because Sarah chose them? Well, maybe not. Does the size of the swatch matter? Somebody tried to organize by size. Might not have seemed originally relevant when you looked at the first batch of swatches. I mean, what does the person who made the swatches want from you? What is the guessing game going on here where you need to figure out what's in their heads? Is there something you're missing? What if someone else comes along and tells you, no, you've done it wrong? These might all be questions going through your mind when you think about this exercise, and you are left with more questions than answers about what the purpose of that organizing activity is and where it's going. What am I trying to say here? We need to notice all the different aspects that might go into a piece of research that involves producing information about the world, organizing it into data, analyzing it, and drawing some kinds of conclusions from it. We need to notice a lot of things. We need to notice the categories we're using, how we define them. Hint, we're going to talk about a conceptual framework. But backpedal from that decision, we need to decide, well, what are we doing here? Why did we choose these categories? Why these color swatches? We need to remember we're asking a question and to relate the categories we chose to the question we're asking. We need to know how we would recognize the categories you've chosen. Do I have a rigorous way for saying, yes, that's a red, no, that's not a red, yes, that's a blue, no, that's not a blue? And can we apply them consistently? So can we take the categories we've chosen and identify them in the data we've produced? That's your analytical framework. How do all these different pieces relate to what we're trying to achieve? I mean, why did we ask the question in the first place? What is our aim? What is our goal? What are we trying to do? And how have other people done this? How have other people categorized color swatches and to what ends? And with what tools and what methods? How have other people done research? Your literature review. We might also say, well, what am I doing when I categorize particular information in a particular way? I analyze and say there's a story to tell here, and I don't think about the effects of that story on the people or the phenomena that I'm studying. So you might be asking some question about color spectrums or enhanced, richness of color around, say, house colors or architecture. But are you thinking about the cultural representations of different colors to the people who will be involved in that project? Are you thinking about if anyone there is colorblind, for example? The point is that, particularly with social science research, not so much with color swatches, but when the things that you are looking at involve people, you need to notice that the questions you ask, the categories you use, the methods you apply need to understand care in relation to the people that are involved, and also power dynamics about who gets to ask, who gets to scrutinize and who gets to be scrutinized, who gets to categorize and who gets to be categorized. Okay. So the color swatch exercise is about getting you to notice that research and how it hangs together is not just a matter of going out there, producing data, and then writing it up. That's kind of what I was asking students to do when I gave them all those color swatches, is I was giving them an unguided, non-purposeful, unstructured data categorization task. And they very quickly, understandably, started to go, hang on, I can't just make data and shove it into categories and go. Absolutely right, you can't. That's certainly not research. What is research then? There are many, many ways to answer that question. But I would have a stab at answering it with the following. I'd argue research is the activity of carefully producing, ordering, and synthesizing information so as to offer an innovative or novel understanding about the world, using a rigorous and defensible approach that supports the truth claims you make with that understanding. So not only are you trying to produce an understanding of the world, but you are trying to present to your reader that the understanding you offer is credible, that it has some usefulness as a truth claim about the world, as well as hopefully the limits of what it's not making claims about. Now, there are some very important words in this definition. Producing rather than gathering. We're going to talk a little bit more about epistemological unconsciousness later, where there is often a tacit transference of ideas from objectivist or positivist natural science research design into social sciences and into qualitative research. Now, often people say, I'm going to gather data. Data doesn't grow on trees. Data is not waiting out in the world for you to go and find it, even in the natural sciences. Data is something that humans make, and we make it by categorizing and carving up the world according to particular schemas, according to particular conceptual frameworks. Even with the natural sciences, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, what you choose to measure, how you choose to define it and delimit it, is as much a function of the epistemology you bring to bear to your questions and the conventions in scientific community and consensus at that time, which historically have not always been the case. So data is not out there waiting to be revealed or plucked or gathered like fruit. We make it. And so I prefer the verb data production rather than data gathering, because it reintroduces into that process the effects of human knowledge processes on what data is and what it becomes. Ordering. Ordering different categories of information have all sorts of implications about what we foreground and what we background, what we deem important and what we deem unimportant, what gets to take precedence and what gets to be marginalized. And we need to notice the ordering that we're using to be clear that we've interrogated that it's an appropriate one for the question we're asking. A truth claim. We are trying to, at least in the eyes of our peers, and preferably humanity at large, we're trying to motivate that this understanding we have developed about the world not only is useful, but somehow reflects the world at least partially. at least partially, and that other decisions can be made premised on this truth claim without the entire argument coming down because the original claim that we made is actually not one that bears out in the world. Rigorous and defensible. For every decision you've made in the design, for every step you've taken, for every category you've chosen, for every piece of literature reviewed, you can say why. How's this relevant? How's this relevant to what you're trying to do? How's this relevant to the data you've produced? How is this relevant to the categories you've chosen? How is this relevant to the question you're asking? You should be able to defend those decisions, which means you need to notice that you're making them. Now, this idea of a defensible truth is not as easy and straightforward as it seems, because our understandings of the world change and hopefully improve. We certainly have not arrived at an understanding of everything and anything forevermore, amen. Far from it, thank goodness, otherwise researchers would be out of a job. Even in the natural sciences, we refine our models that we use to understand what we call objective reality. If you really want to understand some more of this, you can look at Thomas Kuhn's influential work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Put it this way, humans once believed the Earth was flat. The germ theory of pathogens is relatively new. We, for a while, thought that atoms were the smallest unit of matter. That model has now been debunked. The point is that while there is strong consensus internally within the natural science community about epistemology and current contemporary models of how the natural world works, those are still models of the world and not the world themselves. And they are constantly being tested, verified, or refuted and troubled. Einstein's theory of relativity troubled Newtonian physics, etc., etc. So we are constantly refining and improving our understandings of the world. And that means that every truth that we claim to make, any truth claim we make right now, is always underpinned by the fact that, well, tomorrow we might have a better understanding. Now, we've seen historically what can happen when a particular group of people claims to have the superior grasp on reality, in the sense that different epistemologies will constantly be making competing truth claims, often standing on different grounding. But you start to get into the area of human contestation, where one particular group uses power or force to insist that their truth claim is superior to everybody else's and to impose their truth claim on everybody else's. And with the hegemony of, for example, Enlightenment and Western-centric thinking, think of race theory. It's a very good example where you end up with one epistemological, very flawed, very biased claim to knowledge superimposes itself with violence and force on other different types of knowledges. Okay, so it's really good that recently, particularly, there has been a focus on the way that there is more than one way of knowing. There's more than one history to knowing, that how we know is culturally and historically specific. But at the same time, we've also seen what happens if we totally abandon any idea of reasonable sense of truth. And we kind of descend into sort of subjective interpretation and alternative facts. I mean, this is in the middle of the COVID pandemic when I record this, strong backlash against getting vaccinated. A lot of people who are very vaccine reticent. And that is because there is competing misinformation around how vaccines work, who's designing them, what they're good for, how they, what they can do to you, what they can't do to you, and the efficacy in battling a devastating global pandemic. And so we do need to have some kind of evidence and ability to find consensus, even amongst dissenting peers, as to what is the truth and what is not. Because when we abandon or ignore that, we end up in some very, very dark places indeed. So this idea of defensible truth is a sticky one. We want to be able to come to some kind of consensus to go, well, yeah, this is the best truth claim we've got at the moment. I can see how you arrived at it. I think you've used defensible methods to get there. but someone might come along tomorrow with a better claim. Even in mathematics, by the way, you can think of what Bertrand Russell was trying to achieve until Kurt Gödel came along. So we want our understanding of the world to change and improve, but we need to be trying to make the truth claims that we make as defensively and rigorously as we possibly can, given the tools we have available to us at any one given time. And we're really into the thick of the realm of the philosophy of social science. Okay, it's hotly contested terrain, and you don't need to know all the arguments, at least at a master's level, about all these different types of knowledge production and the history of them, etc., etc. Although you'll probably start to read some of them as you investigate your particular area of literature and research. You don't even need to right now decide who you think is right, although you'll start to come to some inklings, I'm sure. But you do need to know that how knowledge is produced is not given, it's not universal, it's certainly not static. And that's quite exciting, actually. While the uncertainty can be at times a little bit anxiety-inducing, it is quite exciting that we can produce new knowledge and improve our understanding of the world. So some of the definitions I'm offering in this session today are suitable for a master's level, for a student in education who's beginning to explore the world of the philosophy of science and social science. But the definitions are at their edges, areas of ongoing debate amongst philosophers and other scholars. And as you become more familiar with the complexity behind some of these terms, how different groups deploy them, how they're used in different scholastic traditions and disciplines, then you'll start to grow in confidence with using them in your own research. Now, one of the issues I think students in education should be aware of, and particularly students in education who are doing qualitative work, is what Stoller calls epistemological unconscious, transferring from natural sciences to social sciences, from quantitative to qualitative methods, assumptions about what good knowledge production looks like. There's a reference for you if you're interested in it. Stoller, 2012, Epistemological Bootcamp. Because there's this prevalent idea that somehow being scientific or rigorous means you do research like the natural scientists do, irrespective of whether that is an appropriate approach for the question at hand. You saw when the student tried to categorize color swatches using the height. Very objective, very rigorous, not very useful. Okay. Now, unfortunately, this preference for certain type of positivist, objectivist approaches gets backed up by structures and by discourses. All of these words are part of the jargon. We're going to get into some of them. But whose work gets valued? Whose work gets funded? Whose work gets idolized and lauded in the public media and in the university backs up this idea that somehow positivist natural sciences are the best methodology for asking any question with rigor and certainty. And that's a very, very strange way to think about doing research. Because at the end of the day, it's not the methodology that should dictate whether the research is credible and rigorous. It's the fit between the methodology and the question. If I said to you, please cook me a steak, and you went and fetched a chocolate cake recipe, well, it might be a fantastic chocolate cake recipe. So what? That's not what you're trying to do. It's not going to get you to a steak. So it's not about whether a methodology is good or not. The goodness of a methodology is always relevant to the question it's trying to answer. So transferring ideas and techniques across fundamentally different types of questions is problematic for a defensible argument. It undermines coherent research design. And ironically, it's not scientific. It's not scientific because there should be a tight cohesion between what you're trying to do and how you're going about doing it. Now, we'll have future sessions on validity and on conceptual frameworks, and also how ideas that are often associated with positivist or natural sciences like generalizability or validity differ depending on the epistemological approach that you're taking, depending on the type of research question you're asking. They're useful ideas, but what they mean is fundamentally different. So the primary differences articulate around what is in the world to be researched, it's ontology, and how to go about producing knowledge about what is in the world, which is epistemology. Another issue that we need to keep an eye out for is a very hazy overlap between normative and descriptive framings of issues. Let's have a little bit more at each of those. What I do want to emphasize, though, with this epistemological unconscious that Stoller talks about is that there is no purity. This is an old XKCD cartoon that I'm very fond of. And I'm fond of it because in my own career, I started as a mathematician and I've ended up as a sociologist of education. And it's always perplexing to people how, given the tacitly normative assumptions they make about what types of knowledges are good or better, or more rigorous, or more difficult, whatever kind of metric they're using to decide one is better and one is not so good, that you start at the supposedly pure, which is nonsense, and you end up at the side of sociology. There is no purity. Okay, there's abstractness. There's abstractness in terms of who is more grounded in doing empirical work versus doing more deductive conceptual work, which is the mathematicians. But this was a very common narrative in the science faculty where I did my undergraduate degree, where the psychologists really wanted to be biologists, the biologists really wanted to be chemists, etc., etc. And there was this strange idea of hierarchy built around abstraction, which mistaked abstraction for rigor or purity. So I think that that idea represents the type of epistemological unconsciousness that Stoller is trying to alert us to. But then this XKCD comic itself got a twist on it at a future instantiation where you've got your supposed spectrum of purity, whatever, and right at the bottom there, purple arrow you can see is pointing to the epistemological philosophers, the people who do the work thinking about, well, how do we know what we know? How do we go about making knowledge? The point is that all knowledge is limited by the understanding of the humans who produced it, and we have to keep that in view. And I would argue that the strongest knowledge claims we can make are those that understand their own limitations, foundations, and their onto-epistemological bases. Onto what? Okay, so specific words. We use a specific register when we're discussing things like the philosophy of knowledge and how research hinges on that philosophy of knowledge. That is that underlaborer, is that stick figure holding everything up. And it can seem pretty tricky when you're starting out in research for the first time. Okay, but don't worry. All these words, ontology, epistemology, discourse, etc., you will come to be more familiar with the ones you need as you read. Now, for this session, when I give it to my students, I also give them a very quick crib notes glossary of a whole bunch of philosophy of social science words for them to use. But look up some of these, some very good explainers on the internet and on YouTube if you are not sure about them. We're going to just pick out a couple today that are relevant to understanding what research is, which is today's purpose. So what is ontology? Ontology is what we think exists in the world. It's the branch of philosophy that posits what exists, and that includes, of course, what exists in us, that our ideas, our beliefs, our cultures, our languages, because we are part of the world. And so ontology also wrestles about what is it that is culture? Does culture exist? How do we know? How might we see it? How might we know it? How might we study it? What exists is a question of ontology. Now, what you research is necessarily shaped by what you think exists to be researched. You can't research something if you think it doesn't exist. Perhaps you might want to refute the existence of something and design your research around that purpose. But here's some examples. For example, do you believe that ghosts exist? If you do, you might say they weren't being investigated. But if you don't believe in ghosts, you're very unlikely to start investigating ghosts. Perhaps you strongly believe that ghosts don't exist and you wish to counter the claim that they do. So then you would have a very different ontology to the person who claims that they do exist. So ontology is about what exists. Another example, this is from the natural sciences. Physicists have long hypothesized the existence of the Higgs boson, a particular type of subatomic particle that they have reasoned might have existed somewhere around the origins of the universe, and that it might tell us some interesting things about the origins of the universe. No one has seen a Higgs boson. You can't pick it up. You can't look at it. However, physicists think there's good reason to believe it exists, and they are trying to research it. A third example, which is a social science example. Do you believe that people are born with an innate IQ? If you do, you'd assume this exists, and you might build your research based on that assumption. But if you don't, you wouldn't. The point is that each of these ontological questions or beliefs shapes efforts to prove or refute the existence of particular phenomena. Your ontology is subtly shaping the questions you ask or don't ask. Epistemology asks the question, how can we know? It's the branch of philosophy that examines how we produce knowledge about the world, and that includes how we study ourselves, with all the complexity that that comes with. So how you conduct your research will necessarily be shaped by what you think you can observe, measure, record, and represent regarding the objects or issues you are investigating. So for our first example, how might one study ghosts? How might you be able to detect their presence? What kinds of claims of evidence would be rigorous and replicable? Could someone take the same information and methods, get a similar result? In fact, most of the research around the presence of ghosts seems to indicate that you can't do this, which is, in most people's eyes, good evidence that they don't exist. In our second example, physicists have built this enormous Hadron Collider to try and study this particle that they think exists called the Higgs boson. They're trying to make one. They've made a whole lot of arguments about the kinds of conditions under which a Higgs boson might be found and how they're going to go about replicating those conditions artificially in order to see if they can't detect this particle. That's a very different type of research methodology to how you're going to see the ghost. Example number 3. Can IQ be measured with a test? How? What kind of test? What conditions would be required? What limitations might this method have? Is it valid? Are you maybe testing for something else by accident, like a child's upbringing or early childhood nutrition or language? How can you show IQ is fixed and for life and doesn't change, etc.? So you've got all sorts of questions about how can you produce knowledge of the thing that you think exists? And how can you do it in a way that props up truth claims that others will find credible? Here you can see that each of these epistemological arguments is specific to the object being investigated. You cannot take a Hadron Collider to produce knowledge about IQs or ghosts. So ontologically and epistemologically, the types of ground you're going to stand on and the kinds of assumptions that you are going to interrogate and then choose depend on the kinds of questions you want to ask and the nature of the object that you're asking it about. Now, one of the other areas we said we would need to pay some attention is something called descriptive versus normative framings around knowledge production. And this is a really slippery, tricky one. It's a sticky issue because the boundary between descriptions and normative assumptions or descriptions versus prescriptions, as they're often called, is very, very porous. It's not actually a hard line at all. It's often attributed to the Scottish philosopher David Hume, called the is-ought problem, about the difference between describing what is in the world versus what should be in the world. Now, Hume posited this as a clean difference, but it's anything but. So there's definitely a case, I'm sure we could all agree, there's a case for the idea that we will make better prescriptions about what should be in the world if we have accurate, rigorous, and rich descriptions about what is in the world. There are so many, particularly in education, there are so many bad interventions based on prescribing what ought to be, what should be, that have not gone to plan. If anything, they've done harm and damage because they are based on a weak understanding of what is in the world. Partial or incomplete or inaccurate understandings about what is inform weak, partial prescriptions about what should be. So we definitely will make better improvements if we have better understanding. And one of the hardest things when you're passionate about your research, as many people working in education are, is to try and suspend your assumptions about what you think should be the case, or to notice them and interrogate them, and really try and investigate what is the case. What I'm trying to say is you need to try and remain as open as you can, within reason, that your understanding is wrong or incomplete of the phenomena that you are looking at. Because if you already fully understand the thing you're looking at, you're not doing research. You're a conclusion looking for a premise. So no matter how much you think you have a sense about what's wrong and what needs to be fixed, you have to somehow go, cool, that's the motivation, that's the aim, the goal, as we'll look later, that's bringing me to these questions. Let me just check I've got my facts straight. And that's not as easy as it sounds, because it's not Hume's guillotine between a nice slice, neat division between is and ought. They often actually tend to kind of get very blended together at multiple levels in research design. Okay, we sneak in assumptions and biases. We are human. Okay, and while proponents of objective or positive approaches, positivist approaches, will often cite the absence of bias in their methods of as their justification for choosing those methods, especially in the social sciences, it's not as easy to avoid bias by simply following the right method. And their examples are plenty of supposedly objective social science that was very, very biased indeed. That included normativity that crept into the questions that are deemed worth asking, the motivations for asking them, the categories used, whether they oversimplify or misrepresent the world, only individual positionalities and blind spots. How can we notice how our experience of the world is shaping what we see? Think about the art teacher who categorized colors in a particular way. And the fact that the things that we look at as social scientists, and particularly as education researchers, are not Higgs bosons. Hopefully, people we're looking at know they're being researched, at least if you're being ethical. They might change what they do or say under research conditions. Even if they're being totally honest, they might still do it subconsciously. It's not always intentional. But when you are researching social phenomena that involve people who are conscious agents and not sort of just detached, inanimate objects to be researched, well, you've got a very different type of knowledge production on your hand. So I think the best way to neutralize bias as far as possible in social research is to not claim methods lack bias, as positivists often do, but to scrutinize carefully where normative assumptions might come in, to interrogate the effects that those assumptions have on your truth claims that you make as far as you possibly can, to hedge against them as far as practicable. So when you go, oh, I might have a bit of a blind spot here. So I'm going to do X, Y, Z as fail safes to see if I can't get at the same information from a different angle to verify what I think I see. So building in redundancy, building in multiple approaches to the same data production in order to try and triangulate and cross-reference and check your understanding. And to be as transparent as you can when you are writing up your research about the strengths and limitations of the design and how you've executed it. So just to kind of package this up, we tend to have interests and questions based on what we think the world should be like. So we all have normative ideas about what would be a better world, particularly in education. And those often feed into the types of questions and research ideas we have. And that's not inherently wrong, but we need to notice those assumptions. We need to notice our normative ideas that are built into our questions and our research design. And before we suggest what should be, we need to do our best to get a handle on what is. Absolute best as we can. And our values and our politics will often creep in when we move from is to ought. I'm going to show you an example of one situation now in education. But the division is not always neat and tidy. That doesn't mean we shouldn't pay attention to it. So here's an example about where our ought creeps in. In South Africa, where I live, there has been an increasingly heightened debate about the adequacy of the education budget, which is interesting because for many, many years, people said, no, the education budget is adequate and it's sufficient to meet the needs of the country. And then a smaller group of people going, no, it's not. Now, finally, that conversation has burst into the mainstream. I mean, it's really interesting to think about the politics of knowledge production as to why that pivot has happened, why this has become something worth talking about, given that the arguments being made by the inadequacy camp haven't changed very much. So there's another interesting thing where knowledge and its value and its truth claims are subject to power. But in this heightened discussion about the adequacy of the education budget, a local prominent economist has finally acceded the point that the budget may be inadequate for its needs, and then moved to a prescription about what to do about it. So the budget is inadequate. That's descriptive. We're finding some consensus on that using multiple different methods. But what should be done about it is prescriptive. That's where the politics and values come in. Some people are saying increase the budget. Some other people are saying slash the costs. In this case, teacher salaries. Can you see how we've moved from a description about the situation to a prescription about the remedy? And how what you value and what you think matters creeps in between the one to the other. That's the is-ought. That's the descriptive normative. And you've got to keep an eye for it in your own research. Not because normative is always wrong, but because you don't want to pass off normative as descriptive. And you don't want to jump to the normative without a good description. If this all feels a little overwhelming, don't stress, because at the master's level, you don't need to understand all the debates, all the intricacies of the entire field of social science philosophy. You just need to know it's there. You need to have a basic idea of what the terms mean, how they apply to your work. So if you trip across a word like interpretivist, if you trip across a word like structure agency for your research, well, then you need to go and dig deeper. As we go on through these sessions, we will be exploring some of these ideas and how they relate to your research and design decisions. But we will also look at how they are powerful tools to interrogate the knowledge that other people have produced and what assumptions underpin their claims to truth. So in our next session, we will talk about reading the field, how one starts to look at literature for the first time when thinking about a research question, and how one starts to chart the terrain of knowledge in the area that you're interested in, and how to interrogate other people's truth claims. And we're going to build up a toolbox that helps you critically examine other people's research, asking on what basis they make their claims and whether their claims are justified on the grounds of those bases. Okay. Phew. So far, we've done a little activity. It hopefully gave you a sense of why we need to pay attention to how different things hang together when we're producing knowledge. We've dipped our toes into some theoretical foundations of thinking about how we know what is true, what is there to be researched at all, what basis we're going to be making claims of truth, and maybe we can use those understandings to interrogate the claims of other people as well. But here is a set of aspects or components that need to hang together in your research design. And we're going to develop these throughout the course. So you'll have an aim or a purpose for your research, or rationale. Why are you asking this question? Why should we be interested in it? What's brought you to this question? The actual question you'll be asking, and your research question needs to be quite a tight, focused, precise question that will indicate what the object of interest is. We'll be looking at literature reviews, how to do them, how to structure them, how to produce a literature review that's more than just a person X said this, but person Y said that. They're not very fun to read, and they're certainly no fun to write. Nor do they make any kind of contribution to understanding your field. We'll look at conceptual frameworks. What are they? Where do they come from? How do we build them? How do they change as research unfolds? We will mention the relation of data production methods to these other aspects and how those must all cohere into a synergistic design. But as I said before, I won't be talking in these sessions about how to run interviews or how to do discourse analysis. And we'll also be looking at validity as it relates to social science, and particularly to qualitative social science questions. And that really is about validity threats. How could you be wrong? How could the data you've produced and the categories you've used to produce it be giving you the wrong end of the stick? There are different types of validity threats in qualitative work, and we'll have a look at them. And of course, this is all underpinned by ethics, beyond just a bureaucratic concern of ticking boxes and making sure that you've legally covered yourself, but to actually say, how is all the aspects of my research design involved in power dynamics? And how am I giving considerate care and thoughtfulness to the people who are involved in the research that I'm conducting? So that's kind of where we're going to be going. And so you start at the beginning, right? Form a question, then review the literature, and then you choose. No, that's not how research design works. It's not how research works, I'm afraid. You have to start somewhere, of course. But you will revisit each of those components many times and you will refine them. We'll look more in the next section about how Maxwell, whose model we use, talks about elastic bands connecting the different components, where there's some give and there's some stretch, but you can't overstretch it. And as you learn and deepen your understanding, not only of your literature and the conceptual apparatus you're using, but also of the terrain where you're conducting your empirical work, you're going to reflect on your prior understandings, you're going to adjust them, you might revise them entirely. So think of the process as an iterative one. It's going to converge on a stable relationship between all the different aspects of your research design. And your research proposal must show the understanding and cohesion that you have developed between these different components. It's got to be clear in your proposal. All the while knowing you cannot know what your data will show you. You cannot understand what logistical issues will arise as you try to produce your data. So while your design is there and your plan is there, it remains open to the unexpected. And you need to be adequately prepared before you apply, for example, for the bureaucratic process of ethics clearance at your university, before you go into the field. Not because you're going to do exactly what it says in your proposal, but because it's the plan, it's a process of planning rather than the plan itself that matters, as Maxwell will say in the reading I prescribe at the end of this session. And as I've said before, if you know what you're already going to find, it's not really research. I would be very skeptical of any master's student whose proposal was absolutely 100% on the dot as it related to what they actually ended up writing in their final thesis. I would question that with a deep skepticism, because it is inherent in the process of conducting research that you discover and make new forms of knowledge as you go. And that will change your understanding from when you submit your proposal to when you submit your final thesis, hopefully. So here is the interactive model of research design from Maxwell that we will use throughout the rest of these sessions. At the center is the research question. So that is the core focus, but it is not fixed. It can change. In many instances, it does change as you realize the limits of the types of data you can produce, logistical or financial constraints come into place, you just can't access a certain community of people you hope to work with, etc., etc. But related to those are the goals. Why are you doing this work? What is the point of going about all this? The categories, the method you use, and how you show that you're measuring the thing you think you're measuring. You're observing the thing you think you're observing. Can you see how those all relate to our color swatch exercise at the beginning? And this is the model we'll use through the rest of the course. What's nice about this model is that it holds for qualitative and quantitative approaches. It holds for multiple epistemological traditions, including critical realism, positivism, interpretivism, etc. So it's a really nice, robust way of thinking about designing your research for internal coherence premised on what you are trying to do. Let's just recap what we've looked at in this session. We started with an activity that made us think about the assumptions that we make when we are processing information. And we realized that the assumptions can come in at many levels. What is the purpose behind what we're doing? What are the categories we're using? Are they replicable? What are they based on? And we could add to that, have other people categorized in similar information, and how do they go about it? What effects do different categories have about how we think about the world? What are the assumptions we're making about how we should categorize information? And then we saw that there was a whole world of the philosophy of knowledge that is dedicated to thinking about what knowledge is and how it is produced, refined, refuted, substantiated, etc. Now, social science and natural science are different in important ways, and we just need to be very careful when we are thinking about our design for our research, particularly in the social sciences, that we are critical and rigorous in relation to what we are trying to achieve, and we're not just lifting one type of methodology from a totally different type of realm because we think that it's good based on some discursive normative idea about what good research looks like. Rather, we don't want to have better or worse methodologies or better or worse research design, but it is better or worse related to the question being asked. And remember, research design is not linear. Expect many iterations and revisions. Now, for those who want their research to change the world, I think that good, credible, coherent, and defensible research is a type of, I would call it a quiet activism, because you're laying the foundations for the truth claims you need to push for change. But the last thing you want to do is push for change based on a weak or inaccurate understanding of the world. And so, if you want your research to change the world, think of this as the first of many steps.